with an easy question to Mr. Mike. The question was, would a PowerPoint slides be available for the viewing of the audience?
Oh, of course, of course.
Right. And so I'm gonna make sure that all of our panelists get a chance to answer the question. So I'm gonna toss them around to different panelists. Our first question came from Ms. Jasmine Strickland. And this is to Ms. Motley Broom or Ms. Charlotte Davis. How does creating a new city help with the housing crisis? If we could answer that question.
I'm going to put that on Charlotte. I think as the disclaimer said at the beginning, I'm not necessarily here to talk about that issue. I don't live in South DeKalb, and whatever the residents of South DeKalb want to do is on you, and I appreciate your opportunity to determine that. So I think from a municipal perspective, Charlotte can probably talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'll be happy to, Mayor, and thank you for the question. I agree. Our organization supports all cities regardless of obviously location or size, and should this city or any others choose to incorporate and go through the process, we are excited to welcome them into our membership. But just from a high level, kind of our perspective on what the benefit of a municipality would offer its community is really just a closer to the people level of representation. And I think the reasons that I would assume individuals in this proposed city area have identified is that DeKalb, you're sitting in a huge county and it's very diverse. There are multiple parts of it. There are competing interests at times. And I think that having a local elected mayor and council that can be out of the communities that you live in and in the districts, you see them at the grocery store, you know, your kids play sports together. That's obviously going to lend itself really well when those are the same people that y'all are going to be advocating to or and talking to about the issues like housing that mean the most to you. So I think just in general, from a philosophical standpoint, it's having an outlet for representation incredibly close to you that also comes in with ability to permit for homes and new homes, ability to go in and do those inspections, ability to provide public safety, should that be a service that your city or any other would choose to have in the future. So I think just efficiency and the ability to respond quickly to community needs is always going to be a built-in benefit to having municipal representation.
I would add that you would get the benefit of the best lobbying team under the gold dome.
I appreciate that. It is at no extra cost.
And thank you for that question. And again, as Ms. Motley Broom stated, none of the panelists here are pro or against cityhood. They're here just speaking on the housing crisis. And I could have stated that question, but I read it verbatim. How do municipalities help with the housing crisis? And then the next question, I'm gonna go to Mr. Mike, and it's from Stephen Benny. What happens when this buy to rent bubble bursts and people can no longer afford the rent rates? And I'm gonna add a second part onto that. In the data, have we seen housing prices where housing prices are increasing, the wages increasing in those areas?
Okay, yeah, thank you for that question. And I wish I had any sort of answer for you, but the fact of the matter is we don't know. Now, one thing that, coming out of the Great Recession, none of these companies, none of these American homes for rent or, invitation homes, they didn't exist before the Great Recession. They existed, they started buying up all of the property because they were buying low. And then, at that point, we were thinking, okay, so they're going to buy low, they're going to hold on to it, they're going to do whatever they can to stabilize the housing market. And so when they were buying it up, I mean, yes, we were concerned, but at that point, if you remember, the state of the housing market during the Great Recession was like, well, at least at least maybe these institutional investors are providing a floor for the housing market. And then what the hope was is that, okay, they would stabilize these housing, they would rent it out, they'd do whatever they could, and then they would start reintroducing all of this stock into the home ownership market once things started stabilizing. Well, that didn't really happen. They're still holding on to this. They're actually buying more, but now instead of buying at the low end of the market, they're actually buying at the high end of the market. And so honestly, I don't know what's going to happen. Now, a couple of things, you have rents and you have home prices. Sometimes those trajectories diverge. So in other words, if rents start declining and the homeowner and the ownership market continues to rise or stabilize, what would happen then is they would divest themselves of the rental stock and reintroduce that into the home ownership stock because that's where the money is. But we don't know if that's going to happen. So all of this is to say, a long-winded way of saying, I don't know. Now to the second part of the question, no. Home prices, where home prices are going up, wages are flat. And so we call that, kind of in the data geek business, sort of like a scissor chart. When you have one trend that's going this way and you have the other trend kind of this way. And that's really been the case for, definitely since the Great Recession, probably even before that. Wages have not been keeping up with home prices in probably the last 20 to 30 years, which is why we're in this situation we are today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. And this is a new thing we're going through. So some of the questions that we're asking, we're still in a blind area of what's going to happen with this. And then, so the next question is, and this goes to Ms. Motley Broom, particularly with the renters, is there a possible course for rent control?
Not in the state of Georgia.
Okay, thank you. And I think we heard that also from Ms. Davis, where she was stating the renters, the landlord to tenant relationships in the state of Georgia are not the best. And then
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interject, but
no, go ahead.
AJC just did a 3-part series on some of the conditions that folks are living in a lot of the same areas that we're talking about today, with multifamily apartments that are, I can't remember the name of the series. Was it deplorable conditions, or it was a so some of the ways in which we don't have protections for tenants in the state of Georgia. Some of those are the worst in the entire country. I am inactive but licensed to practice in Ohio, and started my legal career there. And it was a much longer process to evict someone in Ohio. I was actually shocked when I started practicing here and found out exactly how quickly someone can lose their home. So if you haven't read that series, you should, because it is, I knew a lot about it just sort of being in the position in which I'm serving now, but we see the effects of this in so many different ways. And it's just another perspective to consider.
And this is a toss-up. It's from Ms. Dominique Hoff. Will embracing dense zoning areas along the transit-oriented development help us with the housing, as millennials are not able to afford single-family homes, but we need more townhouses, flats, and condos in the area? So basically, with more density, help to decrease the rising home prices.
I think it's Mr. Dominique Huff, because I think I know him. Hello, Dominique, if this is the same Dominique. I don't know about everyone else. I do think part of the key is density. and increasing density, but being more creative with what we're doing as we increase density. But I am not an expert in this, learning more by the day. I'm curious what Mike thinks about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the overall affordability challenges, remember, there's kind of 6 simple buckets of the way that we're thinking about it. One of them is increasing supply. Density is a way to increase supply. So if you're asking about, well, is density the answer, especially along transit-oriented development, around transit corridors? That's a policy that ARC has been espousing for a decade. Yes, we should be building housing near transit corridors. Absolutely. What's happened a lot, especially in some of these areas that have densified, you do see more and more amenities going in there because densities are going in there. And if you have more and more amenities go in there, housing tends to get more expensive. And then that actually, has this little cycle where at some point, housing becomes less affordable if you don't keep building it, because these places become more walkable, they become more livable, and they become more desirable to live. And so there's a balance there. And if you look at that map that I showed you, you'll see pockets of the region where there are just simply no institutional owned housing. And those happen to also be some of the densest places in the region. Now, correlation does not equal causation, but just spatially, just kind of looking at the patterns, yeah, I mean, I think density would be good on a number of different fronts, but we just got to keep our eye on the ball with just overall affordability.
One other thing, Mike, I think you're absolutely right about the density piece. I think the other piece we have to be cognizant of is the fact that the areas that the most houses are being purchased are areas where people don't scream the loudest. It's people who don't have a voice. I mean, they do, but they don't use their voice. So, I think that's a whole other issue that, you can't morally do anything about that. They've done their homework. At the end of the day, they've looked at the areas that they could go in, make these purchases, and know that they have the least amount of pushback, not only from the laws in the state of Georgia, but from the people that they're affecting. So I think we have to look at that more from a humanistic standpoint also, as we're trying to figure out how to go at this approach and what to do about it.
And I'm gonna piggyback off of that question from Mr. Andrew Bell. And this is another toss-up. Are there any city, county, or state governments that have been successful in preventing the spread of institutional investors, or not even preventing, but slowing down the process of the institutional investors?
I'll be glad to take a stab at that to start off. I think this is kind of like playing a game of whack-a-mole. I think that we've seen, at least from what we've looked at the local level, cities in the metro area, I can name a handful of them, 5 or 6, that have had these companies come before them at pulling permits to, again, this is not existing housing stock in this example, but for development of single family detached homes and a piece of land that they'd already identified and want to start that process. And in response, mayors, council members, their planning and zoning commissions and boards have tried to get their arms around that by passing an ordinance, so local legislation, that puts some parameters on what those developers and what these private equity companies can do. And so an example of that would be things like rental percentage caps. And this gets a little tricky because, again, you have to have all this information up front, know that you're dealing with a build to rent private equity company. Oftentimes that's not disclosed. So we've seen cities wanting to take action where that's one of the prerequisite requirements on an application. What are your plans for these units and these homes that you're going to develop? Things as simple, or what seems simple, like requiring to have the property management group in the state or actually living in the city. You have that if you are a local individual landlord. It's very likely they live in the area, might even live in the actual city where they're renting their property. So the city is going to be able to have a different interaction and relationship with that individual than you will have with an out-of-state, corporate group that's just purchased up some land. And all of those things sound perhaps small, and perhaps, and I know they haven't solved the issue by any means, but at least it gives you a place to start, some backbone of having a code, an ordinance that you can reference. And I think that the goal would be for mayors and along with their local governments to continue to develop those ordinances and what those look like, to try to show that the authority right now does sit at the city and county level on how to address these. It's just hard because the model keeps changing. But I also want to make a plug for that, the AJC Investigative Housing series that Mayor Motley Broom referenced. There's actually a 4th section that came out today, and it is incredibly eye-opening on just how powerful these investors are, and just how much power they have over their tenants. And I don't think that's going to be different whether those tenants are sitting in a multifamily unit or they're sitting in a single family detached home.
And while I have you, Ms. Davis, I'm gonna go right back to you.
Yeah.
Would you be able to summarize HB 94 and SB 1093 and the implications and alternative legislation that can be introduced to provide relief?
Sure, I'll do this very briefly to not take up too much time, and I can also drop the link in the chat. I did see that question. Our organization summarized both of those bills a little bit more in depth during the legislative session on our website, and I'll be more than happy to share that link. But in short, it is very simple in concept. The words on the paper were not difficult for anyone to understand. It literally was 2 or 3 paragraphs just detailing that a city, county, consolidated government would be restricted from placing any regulation or condition. And the definition of condition in the bill is pretty broad. So everything from granting a permit to any type of zoning, placing any of those types of conditions or restrictions on rental companies. So rental, build to rent investors. And if a city or county chose to do that and went against the state law, they could lose their qualified local government status, which is an incredibly draconian punishment, and is tied to state funding, particularly through the Department of Community Affairs, which typically has been the state agency and organization that does things like rental assistance or any type of housing programs, housing grants. So again, I'll share those links in the chat, but not complicated legislation, but would have really devastating impacts if it were to pass just as is. The question, I think the second half was, well, what can we bring to counter? I think kind of the things that I had mentioned, trying to chip away at this landlord-tenant law, trying to get additional powers specifically stated for local governments that that could grant some ability over private equity companies, especially with the existing housing stock. The other half of that right now, like I mentioned, it's very difficult for a city or county to control that. But I think trying to focus on that would be a potential avenue forward. But again, this is very politically challenging, and there's a lot of moving parts to it. And we have not historically had a state that has been eager to run towards rent control or tenant protections. And I don't see that happening in the near future by any means.
And Ms. Broom, I know you spoke on the amount of renters currently in Clayton County. One of the questions we have from Ms. Lloyd Nurse is, are there any federal and state agencies that can help promote home ownership, including builder programs?
Sorry, I didn't hear the very end of your question.
Oh, including builder programs? Are you?
I'm going to lean on some of the other panelists about specific programs. As I said, we've got a down payment assistance program for our employees, and we're working with local banks to sort of help provide pathways and opportunities for various programs. But I know that there are federal programs available. But I also want to sort of piggyback on what Charlotte was saying about being a qualified local government, because we've got 2 projects going on in the city of College Park right now that would not be happening without tax credits from DCA. And it is rental, it's multifamily rental, but it's new construction, which is one of the things that we needed, especially on our south side for quite a while. And one of the developments is actually going right next to the MARTA station, 61 affordable units that are going to be fantastic. It's actually a project in conjunction with the Methodist Church that's been in College Park for 125 years and helping to revitalize that campus. But the projects would not happen without DCA. So the threat of losing that status would mean that we would be hampered in bringing great opportunities to the community. The other project is going to be, some of it's going to be for sale townhomes and workforce housing right next to North Clayton Middle School, which I think is just another way in which it's so important that we are thinking holistically about this. Because if families aren't worried about chasing that next move-in special, then they'll be able to better participate in the school that's next door. And we should be able to see better opportunities and better achievement amongst our kids. So I'm really excited about those projects, but they wouldn't be happening without DCA. So having that looming as a threat, if we quote unquote interfere with build to rent subdivisions, it is a big deal. It's a really big deal. So that's why the bill itself, with both of them, were so troubling. And candidly, I was really when I went down to the Capitol, very surprised at how some of the legislators didn't really have a full sense of what it could mean for our communities. And this was posed by the realtors as something that was about individuals' choice. And I don't think that anyone's advocating that an individual can buy a home and do what they want with it, but it really is that collective action that we are seeing, as Mr. Hudson said, in communities where people don't typically feel as if they have as much agency to create change or to speak out, maybe dealing with addressing those basics and not seeing part of the broader picture as to what's happening to the community. So I just went off on a tangent, I'm sorry.
No, that's great. We definitely needed that information. Thank you. And you actually tossed it over to Mr. Hudson, who I was going to ask the next question to. So it's greatly appreciated. Ms. Hudson, and from a business standpoint, and particularly from a South DeKalb standpoint, we have a lot of older homeowners. So would there be benefits to freezing home taxes values until they are sold so that people can afford their homes again? We know a lot of people own their homes, so they're not dealing with trying to buy new, but they're dealing with their homeowner taxes.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that, as a basic, something that we should always do, we should always freeze these taxes for the elderly. I think it's tremendously unfair when you have an elderly couple who's paying taxes to the school system. They don't have children there. I think that as we look at cityhood efforts, they do a good job of that. Unfortunately, in South DeKalb, we don't have an avenue in which to do that. Long term, I think, you do take a revenue hit for doing that. But I think also on the other side of that, you start to have these legacies that are built in your neighborhoods where, people are able to keep their homes and then be able to pass on the generational wealth. Now, I am a business person. I do think that when that house transitions to that next ownership, we've got to get the appropriate share of taxes for that. But when we have these senior citizens that are on fixed incomes, I think it's tremendously unfair. Now, here I am as a business person. I'd like to think that I have a moral compass, but from my own personal view, I think that that's exactly what needs to happen. And I do think that having the cityhood, you can push that agenda and you can have that happen.
Thank you, Mr. Hudson. And then this goes back to Mr. Mike about the big six. How do we undo the damage from these big six companies? Furthermore, if it can be undone. Furthermore, how do we safeguard communities from other businesses doing the same thing? And they related it to a used car dealership.
Yeah, and I think Charlotte mentioned a little bit about that, about some examples of cities locally that have, at least for, these companies coming in and trying to do a new build, local governments, cities and counties have the power to through their zoning code, through their regular planning process to put parameters on what can be built and who can build it. So that's on the new build. Now, what's happening a lot is these big six companies, and you can expand that out to the big 20 or whatever. They're actually buying homes that have already been built. So you'll have your regular home builder, like a Pulte or D.R. Horton, and they'll put a subdivision on the ground, and then they will negotiate with one of these build to rent companies to purchase a bulk of these houses. And that is something that local governments don't really get a say so in, because that's just, kind of arm's length transactions of existing homes. And so that's where residents need to be very, very engaged. One of the best tools in our toolbox are kind of these local not homeowner, like homeowners associations can be very useful in this, but also kind of these local, kind of these community development corporations can be very useful in that, because you have residents that are invested in the community, and then you also have some capital attached to that. So, yes, it's going to take a small hit to what this is doing, but every little bit helps. So, but I know that's not the best answer, but there are little things that we could be looking at.
And that makes complete sense. And then this is a broad question, and this is very opinionated with this question. As far as what we're looking at right now, do we see affordable housing coming back? And this to any other panel.
I'll start on the path that we're on right now. It's going to be very difficult to get back to affordable housing without a serious calamity in the economy, which I don't think anybody wants that. If we don't start working with our local governments, if we don't start working with residents at large, and really truly engaging with them to let them understand the size of the problem, no, I don't see any quick fix to this. And my biggest fear, and I was looking at this, if you go back to, you look at the median home sales price of San Francisco in the late 80s, early 90s, it was around 280. Now, in today's dollars, is a lot more, but we've seen what San Francisco has turned into, and I'll guarantee you, if we don't start doing something to address our affordability crisis, we'll be right there with San Francisco in 15 to 20 years. So, I know that's doom and gloom, but fortunately, we do have the benefit of time because we are still, relatively speaking, if you look at other metro areas, other big metro areas like Atlanta, we're still relatively affordable. So we have the time to do something about it, but we need to start.
I'm going to add a little bit to this. One of the things I talked about earlier is how this looks going forward. And I talked about the fact that at some point, as they put all these residential houses together and sell them off for the cash flow to these investors, and then the investors not get their return, what happens to all these houses at that point? Does that investor dump them back on the market? Does he sit there and hold on to them? I see another side to that is this, when you have this bulk of houses and if they do come back to the market, what I think is going to happen, it will just saturate the market, and it's going to devalue all the houses that are already there. All these neighborhoods that are stable now, that are doing well, will be destabilized as the houses are dumped into the market. But the challenge is this, it's twofold. One is, getting to a point where there are wages that people can afford the houses. That's a whole nother topic for another day. But also with what we got going on now, the way that this will play out for individuals is that the affordability thing, the crisis is not going to be in the real estate market, is what I want to say. Typically 8-10 years around, the cycle goes around in the real estate market. Well, we're not going to have a typical bust like we typically have, because the supply and demand is still what it is. We have a high demand, low supply. So we're not going to have a typical bust, but we are going to have this affordability and availability issue. Now, how do you figure out a way to merge those two so that we have houses that are available at a price that people can afford? I don't know if it can happen until this thing flushes all the way through the system. And what I mean by that is this. So you got these buyers who are buying all these houses. They have paid top dollar for it. And you talked about them buying the houses in 08 at a lower amount. Well, what they're doing is just cost dollar averaging. They bought some low, they bought some high. Now they're right there from their investment standpoint, which is what they tell you to do on your own personal investing if you're buying stocks. So then on the back end, everybody cashes out, Mike. The people who have bought these homes, they have sold it to an investor. Once again, that investor probably has already bought some insurance somewhere that investment is going to fall apart, so that person who had the houses is going to get paid twice. And I'm not so sure that the people that are buying the houses don't quite know what's going on. I'm one of those people where I realize when you start following the money, there's always a way to insure your investment. So that end investor may be over there, he may have bought some insurance too. I'm in the insurance business. So if you come in here to me today and you got a claim, and I know that I potentially may have to pay $5 million on that claim, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take you to court. I'm going to drag you along. But from the first day that my actuary tells me I got a $5 million potential judgment, I'm going to buy an annuity for $5 million. I'm going to probably pay $2 million for it. It's going to cash out in 5 years, and I'm just going to buy my time. So what I'm saying to you is this: everybody that's involved in this whole investor crisis that we have going on, they all know exactly what the game is. Nobody's going to lose there. So what I'm asking you, or what I'm saying to you, is at the end of the day, one possibility is once all of them cash out, they've all got their money. They don't want these houses. They've all made their money. Either got it from the insurance company or they got it from that sale to that next person. At that point, they may dump these houses back on the market. Now you got a flood of houses that are available to be bought if people can afford them.
Between the two of you, I'm terrified.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I know, me
You're gonna make me lose sleep tonight, both of you. It's either gonna be San Francisco or we're gonna be selling houses for 10 cents on the dollar. Oof.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's somewhere in between.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Hopefully. And I think from the local government perspective, I think we have to be very, very intentional about the things over which we do have control to push the needle on housing affordability. Basically, about a third of our residents live at or below the poverty line. So when we are thinking about bringing new housing into our community and growing our housing stock and having the opportunity with some land that we do have, we've got to be thinking broadly about how we are making sure that we are incorporating all of our residents. We don't have control over those individual sales, but there are some things that from a policy perspective we can put into place and we can focus on to at least try to push the needle where we can.
And Mayor Motley Broom, trust me, I'm the most optimistic person you want to meet. I'm not saying that.
No, wait a minute. I've been on with you since 6 o'clock now, and now you're going to tell me you're the most optimistic person?
I'm not. If you know me, I'm not. I'm just stating one opinion. But and you know what? I do believe in the resolve of people. You know, for whatever that's worth. I think that when we talk and have these conversations like what we're doing tonight, that is the start to moving in a direction where we have some common sense and some common knowledge. You know, what we are fighting is, you know, big money. And what we always have to remember, we're in America. America was built on capitalism. So people are going to try to figure out a way how to, you know, make a dollar. And a lot of times it's at the expense of others. And so if you take that understanding, you know, you don't get mad about it. You just try to figure out what you can do about it.
And get more educated about it. Charlotte put a great article in the chat box. That Wall Street Journal article is fascinating. There is a 60-minute segment from a couple of months ago about this topic, as well as the actual built-to-rent subdivisions. There's a professor at Georgia Tech who's done a lot of research into it as well. Brian on, thank you. So, you know, we've got almost 50 people in the attendees. Make sure you tell 5 people about this. Make sure that you're sharing this information, because I don't think that there's this broad-based understanding where people are connecting these dots and seeing how it's beyond, it's not just that text message that you're getting to sell your home. It's a much broader issue that has so many implications for our community.
Right.
And Mayor Motley Broom, I've been saying Mayor Motley Broom, my apologies.
You know what, if that's the worst thing that happens to me all day, I'm in good shape.
But I want to thank you for the transitions, because you've been helping with the transition. So that leads into my last question. And before I go to the last question, Charlotte Davis answered a question in the chat. I didn't know if the information was available, so I didn't ask the question. It was basically asking what percentage of properties are owned by people out of state. And if you want to answer out loud, or I can read the answer you put in. She's basically saying Redfine and Zillow data showed that 25% in Metro Atlanta were purchased by out-of-state dollars in the first part of 2021. By the second part, it had grown to over 30%. So that's currently the out-of-state purchasers in the metro area. And as I was stating, Mayor Motley Broom put me to the last question, and this is, how do we educate, from Ms. Gloria Moore, how do we educate homeowners about their options? And this is any of our panelists.
Well, I will start. I think it's really, really encouraging to see, 60 or 70 people on this call. A lot of the folks that I work with in our organization are what I would call established authorities and groups. They've already been elected. They're representing formal municipal, city, county governments. They know the outlets to work with the school board, with the chamber, but y'all do all of that as well. Y'all know those outlets, you know those people in your community, and clearly you have interest and ambition in growing a future community. And I would say that the same principles and the same mobilization methods that you're using to advocate for your proposed city, the same outlets you're using with the state legislature, those are the same people who will be very helpful to you in this conversation. I did share the Wall Street Journal article on the Homeowners Association group, which is fascinating. But I'm well aware that a homeowners association might not be the answer in every community, because there simply might not be one in existence. but that same model can work because really all it is vested interest that are talking to one another and they're trying to push back. And that's to me what this group in this body has that that is a huge advantage. So like Mayor Motley Broom said, encourage you to talk to someone else. I would say continue meeting with this group, bring other speakers before you. There are plenty that we even could recommend as we try to educate ourselves on this. Expand it. Maybe you want to bring in people from the county. Maybe you want to get counterparts from the Association of County Commissioners to come talk to you. I would say that informing your legislators of this, and they already are in some degree aware of the subject, but I mean aware of y'all's interest as the people who vote for them, is really, really going to be important as we move on with this topic in the future. So don't underestimate the power you have now. You've already done an amazing job finding one another and identifying this topic. So be loud and let people know that you're interested in it.
4th of July is coming up. Talk about it at the barbecue.
Yeah, and
I mean,
I'd say become a YIMBY instead of a NIMBY.
And also, as Charlotte said, as elected officials, and especially as local elected officials, look, most people have my personal cell number, or they tag me on Facebook. And if I'm hearing from people about a particular issue, we're moving on it, because that's why I'm here. I'm in this position to serve my community. So, and I'm not alone in that sentiment, simply because you don't live in College Park. I mean, your elected officials, if they're hearing from folks in large numbers on particular issues, it's going to turn their attention to it. So speak loudly, speak often, and you know, when you're having the barbecue, bring it up.
And I want to thank all our panelists for coming out tonight. This was very helpful information, bringing light to a situation that's currently going on all around us. So I want to thank Mr. White, Mayor Motley Broom, Ms. Davis, and Mr. Devon Hudson for coming out to speak tonight.